on a mild day. My daughter Lily eagerly asked me to take her to the park. Recently having turned 8, she was full of energy, her laughter filling the cool air as she dashed after the swirling leaves. I sat on a worn, weathered bench, my thoughts drifting, while I occasionally looked up to see her playing with the other children. The soft, golden light of the late afternoon cast a serene glow over the park, making everything appear gentler, almost as if in a dream. As the children scattered around, Lily's laughter suddenly shifted to a high-pitched squeal of excitement. Curious, I looked up from my thoughts and saw her crouched over something near the base of a large oak tree. Her small hands were moving quickly, and her eyes sparkled with a mix of curiosity and glee. She had found something that had captured her imagination completely. She came running toward me, her face lit up with the kind of joy that only children can experience. In her hands was an old, dusty doll. Its porcelain face was cracked in several places, giving it a weathered, eerie look. One of its eyes was slightly askew, as if it had been hastily repaired or maybe just worn down by time. The doll wore a faded dress, once probably a vibrant shade of blue, but now muted and frayed. "Look what I found, Mommy," Lily exclaimed, holding the doll up proudly. There was something in her voice, a mix of innocence and an odd, almost unnerving undertone that sent a shiver down my spine. But I pushed the feeling aside. It was just a doll. After all, a forgotten toy left behind by some other child. I hesitated for a moment, staring at the doll's cracked face and those unnervingly lifelike eyes, before I smiled and said, "It's an interesting find, Lily, but maybe we should leave it here. Someone might come back for it." Lily's face fell, and she clutched the doll tighter to her chest. "Please, Mommy, I want to keep her. She's lonely, and she needs a friend." Her words tugged at my heart. It was just a harmless toy, and I didn't want to quash her excitement over her new discovery. "Okay, sweetie, you can keep her," I said, finally trying to sound more enthusiastic than I felt. Lily beamed, hugging the doll even closer. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the first hints of twilight began to seep into the sky, Lily insisted on taking the doll to her room. I watched her skip down the hallway, the doll clutched against her small frame. A strange sense of unease settled in the pit of my stomach, but I dismissed it as nothing more than parental worry. As night fell, the house grew quiet, with only the soft rustle of the wind outside and the occasional creak of the floorboards interrupting the stillness. I tried to unwind with a book, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the doll. There was something about it that I couldn't quite shake, something that gnawed at the edges of my mind, whispering that all was not right. I brushed it off, reminding myself that I was being ridiculous. It was just an old doll, a relic of someone's past and nothing more. Lily was happy, and that's all that mattered. Later that night, as I lay in bed, I heard Lily's voice floating down the hallway. "You're my best friend, Dolly," she said, her tone light and cheerful. I smiled to myself, comforted by her happiness, but the more I listened, the more something in her voice seemed off. There was a subtle change in her tone, something that was hard to pinpoint but impossible to ignore. I sat up in bed, listening more intently. "Tell me a story," Lily giggled, her voice now filled with an odd mix of excitement and something else, something that made my heart skip a beat. There was a long pause, during which I strained to hear any sound from her room. I almost convinced myself that I had imagined the whole thing when I heard a faint, barely perceptible murmur. It wasn't Lily's voice. It was lower, almost like a whisper carried by the wind. I swung my legs out of bed and padded down the hallway toward Lily's room. The door was slightly ajar, and I pushed it open quietly, peering inside. Lily sat on the floor, the doll positioned next to her. The nightlight cast soft shadows across the room, giving everything a warm, golden hue, but it did little to ease the growing unease in my chest. "Lily, sweetheart," I said softly, trying not to startle her. "It's late. You should be asleep." Lily turned to look at me, her eyes wide and innocent, but there was something in her expression that made my breath catch. "Dolly was telling me a story, Mommy," she said, her voice unusually calm, almost monotone. She knows so many stories. She said she's been waiting a long time to tell them. I forced a smile, trying to mask my discomfort. That's nice, honey, but it's time to sleep now. You can play with Dolly tomorrow. Lily's gaze didn't waver. Her eyes locked on mine with a peculiar intensity. But she's lonely, Mommy. She doesn't want to be alone. There was a chill in the air that hadn't been there before, a coldness that seemed to seep into my very bones. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. Lily, we can talk about it tomorrow. Right now, you need to rest. Reluctantly, Lily nodded and lay down, pulling the doll close to her. I hesitated for a moment, watching her before slowly backing out of the room and closing the door behind me. I stood in the hallway, my heart pounding in my chest, trying to shake off the overwhelming sense of dread that had taken hold of me. Over the next few days, the odd occurrences began. At first, they were subtle, small things that could easily be dismissed as coincidences or tricks of the mind. I would hear soft whispers late at night, indistinct words carried by the wind, barely audible but unmistakably there. Shadows seemed to move just out of the corner of my eye, flickering in places where there should have been nothing to cast them. And the temperature in certain rooms would drop suddenly, a stark contrast to the warmth of the rest of the house. I tried to ignore it, to convince myself that it was all in my head, but it was becoming harder and harder to dismiss. Each night, I would hear Lily talking to the doll, her conversations growing longer and more elaborate. She spoke in a way that was strange for an 8-year-old, using phrases and words that didn't seem to belong to her. It was as if the doll was influencing her, changing her in ways that I couldn't fully understand. One evening, I overheard her say, "Dolly says the dark is our friend. She says we can do so much more if we just let it in." My blood ran cold at those words. It was as if the doll was feeding her thoughts, twisting her innocent mind into something darker. I knew I had to do something, but I wasn't sure what. How do you protect your child from something you can't even fully comprehend? I began to feel a constant weight on my chest, a persistent anxiety that followed me throughout the day. I found myself checking on Lily more frequently, watching her interactions with the doll. The connection between them seemed to grow stronger, and the more time she spent with it, the more distant and detached she became from everything else. She no longer played with her other toys or interacted with the children at school. It was as if the doll had become her entire world. One night, I decided I couldn't ignore it any longer. As Lily slept, I quietly entered her room and gently pried the doll from her arms. She stirred slightly but didn't wake. I carried the doll into the living room, planning to get rid of it, to rid our lives of whatever malevolent force had attached itself to it. But as I stood there, staring at the cracked porcelain face, I found myself unable to move. It was as if the doll was staring back at me, its gaze cold and calculating, daring me to try and dispose of it. My hands trembled, and a wave of nausea washed over me. I felt trapped, unable to act, paralyzed by an invisible force that seemed to emanate from the doll. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I forced myself to take action. I wrapped the doll in an old blanket, trying to block out its unnerving presence. I carried it out of the house, into the cool night air, and drove to a nearby river. I tossed the doll into the water, watching as it was carried away by the current, its lifeless eyes still fixed on me until it disappeared into the darkness. When I returned home, I felt a sense of relief, a lightness that I hadn't felt in days. But it was short-lived. The moment I stepped inside, I was hit with an overwhelming sense of dread, as if the doll's presence had lingered even after it was gone. Lily woke up the next morning and immediately asked for the doll. When I told her it was gone, she didn't cry or protest. She simply looked at me with those unnervingly mature eyes and said, "She'll come back, Mommy. She always comes back." I tried to reassure her, to tell her that the doll was gone for good. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was right. The unease never fully left me. A soft whisper carried by the wind, or a pair of lifeless eyes watching me from the darkness. I've always been a skeptic when it comes to supernatural phenomena. My life was a routine of work, occasional travels, and mundane weekend chores. That all changed one fateful evening when I encountered a doll that would forever alter my perception of reality. It all began with the inheritance of my great-aunt Eleanor's estate. The house, a relic from the early 1900s, was a labyrinth of old furniture, faded photographs, and peculiar items. Among the clutter in the dusty attic, I discovered a vintage porcelain doll. It was draped in a moth-eaten lace dress, its glassy eyes frozen in an unsettling, eternal stare. Despite the chill that crept up my spine, I decided to clean it up. I placed it on a shelf in the living room facing away from the sofa, trying to dismiss the uneasy feeling that clung to me. That night, I heard a soft, rhythmic thumping coming from the living room. My first thought was a faulty pipe or a loose floorboard, but when I checked, everything seemed normal. Next morning, I found the doll had turned around on the shelf. Its eyes seemed even more lifelike, watching me with a cold, unblinking gaze. I tried to brush it off as a trick of the light or my imagination playing tricks on me. But the disturbances only grew worse. Each night, I'd wake to strange noises. Whispers drifting through the darkened house, scratching sounds coming from the walls, and an occasional thud that made my heart race. I began to dread bedtime, knowing that sleep would bring more of the inexplicable. One particularly unsettling night, I heard the scratching sounds intensify. It was as if something was clawing at the inside of the walls. The whispers grew louder, forming incoherent sentences that seemed to call out to me. I lay in bed, clutching my pillow, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread. Around 2 a.m., I heard a distinct rhythmic tapping, like fingers drumming on a hard surface. It was coming from the living room. I mustered the courage to investigate, but when I opened the door, the room was silent. The doll sat motionless on the shelf, its head turned slightly as if it had been watching me the whole time. I returned to bed, but sleep was elusive. The noises continued. A soft rustling, as if someone was moving through the room, followed by the eerie creaking of floorboards. At one point, I heard a high-pitched giggle that made my blood run cold. It was innocent in sound, but it carried an undertone of malice. Determined to get to the bottom of this, I decided to research the doll. I discovered that it was crafted by my great-aunt Eleanor's husband, Arthur. A celebrated doll maker, Arthur was known for his obsession with creating lifelike dolls, his final creation. The one I had was rumored to be his masterpiece, a doll he had imbued with something more than just artistry. The article hinted at dark practices and rituals, but it was vague and left much to the imagination. That night, the whispers turned into urgent, frantic cries. I heard muffled voices pleading for help, accompanied by the relentless scratching that seemed to come from all directions. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the doll and took it to the basement, hoping the isolation would quell the disturbances. In the basement, I placed the doll in the center of the room and sat back, watching it. The scratching sounds continued, now joined by a cacophony of noises, metallic clangs, distant screams, and the occasional thud as if something heavy was being dropped. The air grew colder, and the light flickered ominously. I could hear the doll's dress rustling, though it remained perfectly still. A low, guttural growl resonated through the basement, sending chills down my spine. The doll's eyes seemed to glow with an unnatural light, and its expression twisted into a grotesque mask of anguish. The room was filled with an oppressive darkness, and I could feel an invisible weight pressing down on me. The temperature plummeted, and I saw my breath misting in the cold air. The growling became more insistent, mingling with the whispers that now formed a chorus of despair. I felt as if I was being suffocated by an unseen force, my heart pounding in my chest. My attempts to leave the basement were thwarted as the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. In the darkness, the doll's head moved slowly, its eyes tracking me with an intense, malevolent gaze. The growling grew louder, and the scratching sounds became a frenzied, relentless pounding. I could feel the vibrations through the floor, and the walls seemed to pulse with an eerie, rhythmic beat. I tried to call for help, but my voice was swallowed by the cacophony of sounds. I stumbled back, tripping over objects in the darkness. As I reached the doll, its eyes seemed to pierce into my soul, and the whispers intensified, forming coherent sentences. "You took me from my creator. You must pay the price." The air became thick with an oppressive energy, and the whispers turned into a deafening roar. The doll's eyes glowed brighter, and the temperature in the room dropped even further. I felt a sharp pain in my chest, as if my very soul was being torn apart. The walls seemed to close in on me, and the scratching reached a fever pitch. Desperate to escape, I grabbed the doll and threw it against the wall. The moment it hit the ground, the noise abruptly stopped. The room fell into an eerie silence, broken only by my ragged breathing. The doll lay motionless, its eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. I managed to force open the basement door and fled the house. I spent the night in a nearby hotel, unable to shake the feeling that the doll's malevolent presence was still following me. The next morning, I returned to the house, determined to leave it behind. But the doll was gone. The basement was empty, and there was no sign of the horrors I'd experienced. I moved out of the house and tried to forget, but the memories haunted me. The whispers, the growling, and the relentless scratching remained etched in my mind. To this day, I can't escape the feeling that the doll's last creation is still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next victim. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I hear faint whispers and scratching sounds, and I know that the terror I experienced was only the beginning. The doll's malevolent essence still lingers, a chilling reminder of the price I paid for curiosity. Even as I try to move on, the doll's presence remains a constant, haunting reminder that some things are better left undisturbed. I first noticed the old shop on the corner of 8th and Elm one chilly autumn afternoon. The narrow window, filled with dusty trinkets, seemed to beckon me with its faint, nostalgic allure. I was drawn in by the quaintness of it, a rare escape from the sterile modernity of my life. Inside, the shop was a cluttered labyrinth of antiques and oddities. Dusty chandeliers hung from the ceiling like forgotten relics, and the wooden floor creaked with every step. Amidst this chaos, my eyes landed on an old doll, perched incongruously on a high shelf. Its porcelain face was chipped, its eyes a pale blue that seemed too lively for something so inanimate. Its hair, a tangled mess of golden curls, framed a face frozen in a perpetual, unsettling grin. Curiosity is the real thief, I thought as I picked it up. There was something captivatingly eerie about it, but I shrugged it off as the effects of the shop's dim light. I purchased it for a mere $10, thinking it might make a unique conversation piece. The doll sat on the passenger seat as I drove home, its eyes seemingly following me through the rearview mirror. The moment I brought it inside, a chill settled over the house, an icy draft that seemed to whisper with an unsettling familiarity. The whispers began almost immediately, soft, insistent, and barely audible. I could never quite make out the words, but the tone was unmistakably malicious. At first, I dismissed it as my imagination. But the whispers grew louder over the next few days, especially at night. I would lie awake, the sound of muffled murmurs filling the darkness, mingling with the creaks and groans of the old house. The doll sitting in its place on the shelf seemed to be the source. Its eyes followed me, blinking in and out of my peripheral vision. I researched the doll, hoping to find some logical explanation for the disturbances. I discovered that it was not just an antique. It was a known item in paranormal circles. The doll was said to be possessed, a vessel for something far more sinister. There were reports of eerie happenings, of families plagued by its presence, and of the doll's influence causing strife and fear. Panic set in as I read more. I found stories of people who had experienced the same inexplicable phenomena. Whispers, shadows, and objects moving on their own. The stories all had one common thread: the doll, desperate to rid myself of it. I decided to return it to the shop, hoping to sever the link between it and the dark presence that seemed to have settled in my home. I went back to the shop, which appeared just as it had on that fateful day. The owner, an elderly woman with a knowing gaze, accepted the doll without a word. As I left, I felt a brief sense of relief, only to be replaced by a lingering dread. The whispers had stopped, but an oppressive silence hung over the house. I couldn't shake the feeling that the doll had left something behind, that it had not truly departed. That night, I woke to the feeling of being watched. The doll's eyes seemed to pierce through the darkness of my room, even though it was no longer there. The echoes of its whispers lingered in my mind, a constant reminder of the terror it had brought into my life. The shop remained, and so did the rumors about the doll. I never saw it again, but I often wondered if it was truly gone, or if it was waiting for its next unsuspecting victim. The whispers, now just a memory, still haunted me, a chilling reminder of the night I brought home something far more malevolent than I could have ever imagined.